Hi, I'm Ashley SWARTZ, CEO of Furious Corp, Dean of the Beat University faculty. I'm excited to be here. This is our fifth class, sorry. I think sixth video we've created since this whole COVID-19 thing. So super glad that you're here. Andy and Furious and I, and our goal is to bring a little light in the midst of this darkness. And hopefully the darkness is over soon and everybody is still well and healthy and safe. And also, I want to thank you guys for your great feedback. It's helped us continue this whole thing and to sort of continue on beyond the first sort of stage of this whole challenge for us as an industry. So, what we do every here Wednesday at 1 o'clock is a little bit of education, a little bit of brush up, right, on LinkedIn Live, and just really, Beat University is about brushing up, helping titans of the industry or the new of the industry that are home and dislocated, do a little bit of learning and to, get ready to come back strong whenever we are able to be together as colleagues in an industry. So the first 4 videos in our series were really about fundamentals. We had this companion piece. It was this interactive TV and video dictionary that Furious Corp had created that we had shared, and we chunked that into different sections or themes and used that to kind of level set the lexicon about the industry and just do some education and conversation. So hint, you can go catch up if you want. They're all available on Beat or on FuriousCorp.com. Go watch these videos, and then we're going to sort of take that up to the next level and have more conversations about the macro factors of the industry and ultimately how we get past this and we recover and rebound faster. So, from here forward, we're going to use those fundamentals. And I think it's really important. When I've been reading a lot of the trade press, so much attention is being paid to buyers and advertisers and how they need to spend differently, et cetera. And the attention that's getting paid to sellers it's fatalistic and it's more panic porn, as I talked about last week. How media companies are suffering and traditional television is challenged and all that. And I'm really fatigued by that, and I'm done. So that's noise to me. So for me, this signal was about the opportunity that this reset has afforded us. And I want to talk about that today, specifically the opportunity for sellers. So, and the beautiful thing is that creation of economic value for sellers is creation of economic value for the entirety of the value chain because they are the source. Buyers, for every ROI of every dollar they spend, and then ultimately those in the middle as well. So, at the end of the day, today we're gonna discuss what this reset requires to come out and, rise like a phoenix, if you will, right? What does it require for sellers of TB to rebound and foster resilience? We're gonna talk about 4 R's. They are to recover, to reset, recover, rebound, and find resilience after this, right? And so I pulled a lot of content from today, from 3 blog posts that Furious Corp has posted over the last, say, 6 weeks. This is the URL for our blog site if you want to go look at it and read some of these articles that relate to it. But, I just want to talk about what I see to be the legs of the stool in regards to accelerating recovery and creating sustainable resilience. I think in order to do that, we need to start by reframing resilience for particularly sellers, right? So there was a first video that I created out of this series about being a lighthouse. And I talked about many things. And one of them is that one of the things that we're learning about ourselves in this reset, especially in the beginning, is that brute force is not going to change our circumstances, right? So resilience is defined by Webster's as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. It's toughness. In the context of today and after this reset, resilience requires a different toolkit, right? So pushing hard, working faster, better, faster, stronger, all that stuff, more drinks, more dinners, more networking. It's not going to create a steeper slope of the V. It's not going to actually accelerate the time to the inflection point. And ultimately, it's not going to bring recovery sooner. So I think that we need to reframe that so that ultimately what we know now is that recovery is not going to be quick. And that because to be resilient to recover, this will require sellers and brands and cultures to reimagine and rethink sort of not just maybe how they do what they do, but actually what they do is pretty essential. We really need to open our minds. And the reality is that simply being tough won't be enough to get past this and through this and still thrive. So many companies, I think after this, we discussed this, I experienced this, chose another R in response to this. And that was to react, right? So I did this Kundalini workshop like probably 2.5 months ago before this whole thing. And the teacher said something very salient that I wrote in my notebook right away. And that was that ultimately what we need to do as human beings is to be conscious and present to not react to our reactions. Because our typical initial reaction to anything is our ego, right? And ultimately as human beings, ego undermines our happiness and our joy, right? But if we look at companies and entities or industries, reaction is really driven by fear, right? So immediate layoffs, furloughs, buying cheaper toilet paper, if you can find it, like whatever that may be, right? That was a reaction to fear. Fear and a lack of pre-existing resilience, which is so crazy to me because so many of these companies that took these kind of knee-jerk responses or reactions that were driven by fear have amazingly healthy balance sheets. They've been out spending money, making acquisitions, etc. So this idea of what resilience is also, I've learned humbly that it's not just about the cash sitting on your balance sheet, right? And what your assets look like. So today we're going to talk about the opportunity. And you know me, I'm a glass half full person. And I think that this reset's been provided to our industry. Again, this is for us, not to us, right? So in particular, this reset has given TV sellers the opportunity to pause, be thoughtful, and take actions that are honestly, if we're keeping it real, long overdue, right? To improve their yield of their assets and their portfolio, improve ROI, that every dollar spent is the ROI of every dollar spent delivered to their buyers, right? And then ultimately retool their businesses for resilience now, after this, and in the future that is sustainable. So in today's class, we're going to focus on traditional spot sold television inventory because for me, that's why I get my butt out of bed in the morning. I like big, hairy ass problems. And this is an industry where like 300 to 400 basis points of greater efficiency or revenue improvement or plugging revenue leakage is billions of dollars. That's exciting to me, right? So this is an alternative, which still exists and is out there to sort of chasing that new, which is what the media and ad tech and advertising industry is typically done for the last 25 years with the sort of introduction of digital and growth of digital, is to chase net new. So for television, net new is addressable, it's over the top, it's AVOD, et cetera. And that's not where we're going. We're talking about making legacy, steadfast anchor businesses better, faster, and stronger, and more resilient, most importantly, to enable that recovery to be quicker. So let's get into it. I've got this buddy, his name is Albert Einstein. I like smart people because he likes data too. And he's this definition of madness or definition of insanity, right? And those that know that I love data because data doesn't lie. So, at Furious and in my job every day, we look at like billions of line items of sales log level transactional data from tracking systems for TV sellers. And, that's billions of spots, right? And we ingest that every day and we analyze it, et cetera, from multiple different clients, et cetera. Every client's a snowflake. Every data, a set of data is a snowflake. But ultimately, the same narrative forms across all linear TV sellers. So there's a few universal truths that we see, and I'm going to focus on 3 today because I believe they are ultimately the accelerants to recovery and the foundations of resilience for traditional linear TV sellers. And they are ultimately, ironically, they sort of map to like traditional economics, right? The supply and demand, but then ultimately price and volume, right? Which are the 2 levers of yield. So I want to go through those and unpack those in detail today. Those 3 specific things that I think we see universally across all sellers as the greatest opportunity to both in 3 things actually: improve revenue, improve profitability because you reduced operational costs and through automation efficiency, and just basically make the lives of everybody easier every day, right? So the first one is that one of the largest causes of revenue leakage for spot sold television inventory is price variability. Price variability is a sign and a symptom of pricing inefficiency. That means money's being left on the table. The second is that there is an over-reliance on high-value inventory of sports and programming, which results in significantly increased operational costs and inefficient utilization of inventory. I'm going to get into that. And I'm not suggesting that, this is an opportunity that we've lost all that inventory overnight, but there is an over-reliance on it. And we haven't actually tooled the business to be able to ensure that inventory efficiency is a KPI and how we sort of assess the performance of a sort of linear TV business in aggregate. The third is that data is not readily accessible and able to be utilized to make better pricing, revenue, and inventory management decisions. Pricing and planning processes and sales processes of most linear TV sellers are not data-driven. It's not for lack of desire, but the reality is it's hard to extract that data and find the signal and the noise out of legacy tracking systems, which are 20, 30, 40 years old, and then ultimately do it in a meaningful enough period of time that they can use it to make better decisions day to day. So that's an opportunity. Our industry, like most, is in the middle of a crisis, right? We know that, but we also know there's another just truth that transcends industries that is just sort of a human truth, is that doing the same shit different day is not going to get us through this, right? We have to, that is madness, according to Einstein. We have to take a different approach. Literally overnight, we lost our most valuable inventory. So we have to do things differently. And if you look to other industries that, in an efficient market, all of a sudden one day wake up and, they have a sudden loss of inventory capacity, a radically different demand patterns and changes in demand from the market, their response would be to do a couple things. It would be use data to reassess and develop reliable forecasts to understand what demand and then ultimately what supply is. They would implement systems that would help their sellers and would help optimize their supply chains to maximize the yield of their products and their product portfolio. And then ultimately they would do an assessment of operations to automate costs, improve efficiency, increase profitability, and reduce, just sort of churn and burn of their teams, right? And also to do more with less. So in TV, though, our initial reaction, if we're just being honest and looking in the mirror, and that's what we do for people we love, we provide a mirror to them, is that what's our response is typically to do a couple things. It's to discount spot rates to drive more volume, introduce shiny new objects, maybe use some jazz hands with which to offer them to market, and new products to displace sort of revenue lost, i.e. from this crisis. It's to play with priority codes in the tracking system to make sure something gets delivered, it doesn't get bumped. We can sort of do some puts and takes here and there, or it's to replace, right? So what we're doing right now is replacing baseball and PGA with documentaries about epic basketball players, right? And basketball legends. Or it's like making the living room now, the studio, it's like No Pants Tuesday on the morning news hour. Whatever it is, it's still just more of the same. And we need to reimagine and rethink if we're going to transform and manifest resilience. So I think, this is all in lieu of making the hard decisions and rolling up our sleeves and implementing data-driven pricing and creating new constellations of products, right? And packages of products so that, the billions of these ad impressions that are not going away for television deliver maximum economic value to sellers, to buyers, to shareholders, to the industry alike, right? So I'm going to find some thoughts today on how we can do that and ultimately come out of this baby, and recover and rebound faster, and make it last. So let's start with pricing. I'm just going to say it, set it and forget it. It's not a pricing strategy. And I'm going to make it with a bold statement. If since this whole COVID thing, you are a seller of linear television and you have not updated your rate card, you are leaving a lot of money on the table, right? So, and let's be clear, it doesn't end there. Revising and updating rate cards is not enough. You have to actually make sure that the rate cards, if the rates have meanings and they're more data driven, and they're refreshed and they're current, that ultimately then they are adhered to, right? That actually people are using those rates to make pricing decisions, and there's a governance process that surrounds that and controls in place, right? And so I want to just back this up with a little bit of context, right? So live sports or tentpole events, which I was sort of saying is the core revenue driver, right? They typically contribute 80 to 90% of a TV seller's total revenue for spot-based inventory, right? But they typically only account for 10 to 20% of volume. So as of March, all of a sudden, as we just said, overnight, a huge percentage of high value programming has been wiped out. And so this, these prospects now fall, we have, when we look at what's coming for the fall, even after we get out of this crisis, in the perspective ahead, or prospectus ahead rather, is that with production stoppages and there will be content shortages, we won't have all of a sudden this onslaught of premium programming coming back into our schedules. It's going to be a very slow roll. So if you consider these points in a vacuum, it's really easy to gravitate towards what a lot of our trade industry and trade publications have done, which is the story is grim for sellers, the math is grim, right? But what's missed, I think, is the impact the removal of sports and other tier one programming has, or high value programming is, that all of a sudden now, because you have a constraint on capacity, is that potentially what we see is that because viewing has remained pretty consistent, if not grown a little bit, is that potentially tier 2 and tier 3 inventory has become more valuable, right? So what does that mean? It means what we need to do is we need to recast and reconsider what is premium inventory for TV sellers, right? So I'm not saying the price of every program is automatically going to go up, right? It's not that simple. And if you naively think that you just a broad brushstroke, your new rate card is a 10% increase on everything that is not high value, sports or fixed position sales, you're very naive. So, but we do have the cases going back to The Last Dance, the 10-part series by ESPN that was, the first run was moved up by 2 months, given the lack of sort of sports programming. There is ultimately a huge amount of opportunity there. That's a documentary that would have been valuable, that probably increased 3-4x in value because of the lack of sports, and just, the resonance it had in a moment of time when it was a vacuum otherwise with Jason or similar programming. So the NFL draft was also something like that, right? So notwithstanding the fact that large swaths of inventory are inherently more valuable now, right? What we also see, sorry guys, what we also see is that there is inconsistent pricing and, hold on one second, sorry, live LinkedIn. There's also inconsistent pricing within these sellers organizations, right? So in the absence of pricing controls and workflows, salespeople often deviate from rate cards and offer discounts, as we said earlier, to move volume. And this leads to revenue leakage. So you've got this sort of swath of inventory that has not been appropriately reassessed, and sort of inventory itself hasn't been evaluated in a different way, in a different context now, vis-a-vis the absence of what was ultimately previously higher valued inventory. We haven't actually reevaluated prices as well. And, we consistently find in the data that the variability and lack of assessment of the inventory available in capacity vis-a-vis demand and how that informs pricing, when not looking at all those in conjunction, there's money being left on the table and there's an opportunity to improve yield significantly. The other big issue is just the frequency with which we update rate cards, right? So lack of pricing controls isn't the only culprit in revenue leakage. So ultimately what we end up with is that most organizations are updating their rate cards quarterly, annually, right? And it doesn't account for subtle movements in supply and demand that may occur. Specifically now when you have huge shifts and you have sort of, advertisers that are waiting to see what's happening with lockdowns, with, staying home, and as people are sort of, individual states are coming out, especially in local television, what that means. And we need to be more conscientious of the fact that those rate cards need to be updated more frequently. Pricing variability isn't new, but right now in a moment of time with the volatility in the market, variability has increased. We have seen that, right? And ultimately the implementation of pricing controls will result in deals falling through, as well as we'll sort of reassessing rates. If we update rate cards based on new information and we stick to those rate cards and enforce them, we're going to lose one-off deals, but the value of the portfolio is going to ratchet up incrementally and gently over time. And that's the goal, is to increase portfolio value for a linear TV seller over time. The ultimate future state is data-driven, more dynamic pricing, but we gotta, crawl and walk before we run. So we'll get there. The reality is that this sort of, as I've talked about, the levers of yield being price and volume, these pricing principles go hand in hand with better, more data-informed and data-driven inventory management. I'm gonna get into that now. So ultimately, when we look at inventory, particularly around sort of how inventory has moved historically, we need to think about reprogramming our packaging and inventory management muscle memory, particularly because so much of our packaging and our inventory sort of allocation strategies as linear TV sellers has been driven by that fixed position anchor, sports and high value programming, right? And so what happened is you have these collections of content that we bundle together, whether it's by sort of probabilistic audience profiles or it's other variables or event types, et cetera. And then we come up with package rate, right? Or it could be around premium sports. The reality is that rate is typically nothing more than a blended CPM or some discount rate for the sake of moving more volume to incentivize a buyer to buy a package. The reality is that sales drives most of these decisions, the termination of package, which means your market is typically, or your buyers are typically defining those packages for you. So the reality is that the feedback loop is important from the marketplace, but it can't be your only signal. You can't let your buyers tell you how to productize and package your linear TV portfolio, right? Ultimately, you also can't let them cherry pick audience and inventory, because that just means that your portfolio and yield optimization processes become more and more difficult and more burdensome to your sales and pricing and planning teams. So to avoid leaving revenue on the table, I think it's important to look how packages are typically created, right? And ultimately that we move that process of packaging and inventory management a little bit upstream from the sales process so that it becomes a yield optimization or I didn't turn off my notifications. It becomes a yield optimization or ultimately a strategic business function, right? So that it's something that we end up at a place where we can allow the sales folks to be collaborative partners, but ultimately give them something to take to market and sell with ease. So what's the impact of a package, right? How am I other inventory? That's one of the most important questions. So putting a package together has serious downstream effects. So when you all of a sudden remove large swaths of inventory, like we're doing with a package, and stripping out chunks of time that otherwise would have been available for what are broad rotators or general day parts, which is how a good percentage of inventory is moved in traditional linear television. In a tight sales window, you have a position where you have a lot of churn for the inventory team. So you got a lot of massaging the logs, which is that process of when you see multiple demand sources coming out of your trafficking system, or your booking system rather, for a specific spot or a specific unit, and someone actually has to match that one-to-one, right? It's a very manual process in TV. And when you don't have visibility of the inventory, or you sort of bundle these packages blindly, you end up in a situation where multiple sources of demand are actually being put up against a single spot or a single unit. And that is a process of risk management and exposure and liability and all those things. That's a lot of work. Ultimately, rates tend to remain exactly the same prior to the package versus after the package. So packages are created potentially to improve inventory efficiency or inventory KPIs, but they don't actually end up resulting in greater revenue, because ultimately the blended rates are about the same, right? Or even less, or there's a discount. So the bottom line is, again, that with packages and doing them somewhat blindly and not driving them by data and analyzing the impact of the package on the business, you end up in a situation where you're leaving revenue on the table. And the last question that really needs to be asked is, how does this package contribute to my portfolio, right? Ultimately, what is the impact on my portfolio value? Prices of packages are often, again, determining by looking at last year prices, right? Or applying a fixed percentage increase. And so ultimately, it doesn't get us to a place where we are actually improving revenue or improving yield or improving margin, because there's more work created as a result. So within the enterprise of linear TV sellers, there's a treasure trove of data, right? Historically sold inventory, our sales transactions, our pricing, et cetera. So we need to leverage that to better inform how we productize and package linear television inventories, in order to make sure that packaging is a product for growth and resilience ultimately. The last question actually should be, the last one was not, sorry, I forgot I had number 3, is, should this even be a package? Like, run the scenario analysis. That's one of the issues we have with not having data and readily available inventory visibility and transparency, and a line of sight to what the true value of that inventory should be, is we can't run the scenarios and analyze whether or not this should be a package and it should be as part of our portfolio, right? Am I going to make more money at aggregate, at a top line? I'm going to move this sale, but ultimately at the end of the day, am I going to improve my, my business unit, for this specific linear product, am I going to improve its performance overall? And that question is really hard. And in a dynamic marketplace, it's even harder when the value of inventory changes week to week and we have demand pressure, which we see as one of the unique things about local television, is that their businesses run week to week and are very market driven. And especially now during COVID, have become even more dynamic and fluid. We have to do the math in advance. And ultimately, we have to leverage data to inform decisions, if not allow data and data science to prescribe decisions and automate the making of them, right? So, if we do this correctly, and if sellers really look at ultimately inventory management and packaging and sort of product management becoming a strategic business function that sits upstream, that becomes part of the yield management or pricing and planning processes, they end up becoming in service of the sales team, right? So the whole purpose of packages is to make buying more easier. And if buying is easier, then selling is easier. And this becomes a partnership that is a win-win for everybody. So it's really ultimately key that data is used to make better decisions, and that ultimately salespeople's jobs are easier, and that clearance is more likely. So what is not happening is that by creating a sort of proliferation of packages infinitum, that you end up in a situation where you may have made smart packages that will increase revenue, but now they're competing with one another, and clearance of that inventory that is in high demand, that you've recasted as now premium or tier 1, becomes a problem. So, what we can't do is bite off our nose to spite our face, which sometimes we do if we react too quickly. So the last part of this sort of conversation today is just data, right? And I believe data is going to be the fuel for recovery and resilience for every single seller, and honestly, every company, period, done, full stop, right? So, core business decisions in today's kind of media businesses and for sellers are often made using Excel, And, that's the tool of choice. It's what is available and what runs their business. But the wheels fall off the bus when we start to bring in more real-time, voluminous amounts of data to inform decisioning, which we have to do to ensure that we're making the right decisions right now at this moment of time and for the foreseeable future. The metaphor I always make is it's like racing F1 with a minivan, right? So just some sort of data points that I think is really relevant about this. This is broader than media, but some research has shown that a lack of actionable data hurts your earnings per share by leaving substantial revenue on the table. So it was a University of Texas study found that the average Fortune 1000 company could increase revenue by more than $2 billion annually just by increasing data usability by 10%. And here's the kicker that makes my heart smile, is granting salespeople greater access to data along with increasing data quality would increase return on equity by another 16%, right? So help them, salespeople, make decisions, and then also empower them with data to make better decisions on their own when they are working on their own. So, data for us, data and particularly sales transactional data, if it's harnessed to drive pricing and inventory decisions, it has, and we've seen in the work I get to do every day, which is why I love getting out of bed, is because I can measure and quantify the economic impact for my clients that data provides their business. And ultimately, there's a significant opportunity to increase revenue and reduce ultimately operational costs for them across the board. Recovering and rebounding is going to require the right tools for the job, right? And resilience, particularly sustainable resilience, is going to require a willingness to not just adopt new tools, but ultimately change the way that we as sellers frame, make, and execute business decisions. So, ultimately, there is a huge opportunity for us. It's whether or not we're willing to roll up our sleeves and do the work. So how can we integrate sort of data into the business decision-making process for sellers, and particularly for linear television? I think the first opportunity, first and foremost, is we need to provide more detailed granular reporting that prescribes action and puts controls in place, and also sort of affords this what I like to call early warning systems, right? So these are opportunities for sales and yield or pricing and planning teams to actually kind of lean back and let the systems or data do the work for them and tell them what they should be paying attention to, and ultimately help them identify opportunities, to assess risk, to manage risk and mitigate it, and then ultimately be able to better serve and manage and productize and package their portfolio and price it ultimately, right? So it's pretty straightforward. So the number two is to actually give a line of sight to tomorrow, right? What data, and then when you couple that with data science, affords us is the opportunity to provide and have more accurate demand, supply, and revenue forecasting. And if we leverage machine learning and all the cool things that are available today to manipulate data in real time, as near real time as we can get in television, to incorporate more advanced mathematics, right? We can arrive at more accurate forecasts. And if we have more accurate forecasts, particularly when, for example, in local television, we may only be able to access, what are ultimately sort of monthly average forecasts, or ratings measurements and things like that. Infusing more accurate forward-looking forecasts into any pricing or inventory management decision is going to improve it and deliver more revenue naturally, right? Today a lot of decisions about inventory in the future are made from the CRM system. Like for example, Salesforce. Many sellers have implemented CRM systems of recent. The integrity of the data and consistency and the quality of it isn't necessarily there yet, right? There's a lot of change, but that's really about anticipation. That's gut. That's hope. That's the sort of subjective nature of how an individual salesperson looks at their market and whether they're a glass half full or a glass half empty person, right? It's not really looking at things like predicted variables, seasonality, changes in programming, scheduling, holidays, school schedules, things like that, month-to-month comparisons, right? All of those things that actually drive and help impact your ability to accurately forecast and the efficacy of forecasting logic for the future. Those are all things that machine learning and data science can basically append with your data to give you forecasts to make better decisions. The next is to optimize pricing. We've talked about this, sort of extensively in the first section, right? But ultimately, if we leverage data and we leverage forecasts forward-looking on both supply and demand, we have the opportunity to more efficiently price our inventory and to better manage different types of inventory, specifically sort of for national, right? Upfront versus scatter, how we more dynamically price scatter, how scatter's price and value is impacted now that the upfront has sort of gone away as a business cycle within that industry because of this crisis. All of that is sort of an opportunity. And then how things are changing week to week for different zones, for example, for television operators, for MVPDs that are selling inventory in specific geographies. If that geography has opened up and the lockdown's down, you have restaurants, for example, or other businesses that are not essential workers that have an opportunity now to come back to market and want to come out and send a message. So I think, those are very interesting factors that or interesting variables that when considered or being able to be incorporated into our pricing or our yield decisions will ultimately result in improvement of yield. The last that we've talked about is greater allocation of efficiency and inventory utilization, right? That's pretty straightforward. And that's kind of where we came from, right? So ultimately, everyone is faced with the challenge of efficiently allocating inventory between different types. So national interconnect for MVPDs, or, national versus local spot sales rather, upfront versus scatter for national sellers, right? And this becomes even more challenging then in the future when you start trying to bundle over the top or other digital inventory into this. So ultimately, we need to understand which inventory is irreplaceable, right? And then what's the opportunity of giving those spots away? What is the opportunity cost? And then how do we package and bundle that inventory, whether selling it as day parts, selling it as rotators, selling it as individual high value spots, and reimagining the value of those spots because data has told us they are more valuable than we may have thought they were. All those things really should be inputs into determining how we productize, package, and take our inventory to market. In finality, sort of outside of the levers of yield, it's just about managing risk, right? So there's so much work involved because we sell and we move inventory and we have to make good on it and we have to rework because it gets bumped or got preempted in the trafficking systems. And data science and forecasting in particular can really significantly impact the churn that, make goods and re-expressions have on a sales operations organization, and ultimately significantly manage and help mitigate risk for sellers, right? And just in general, make a lot of manual work a lot easier or eliminate it wholly. So, sellers often sort of input a deal with no certainty as to whether or not it's going to clear, right? And that's a big issue because of how unique trafficking systems are, their preempt decisioning, whether it's rate rules driven, et cetera. And so, when we look at how a trafficking system works, and then we consider then how the sales process works, if we infuse data into that process to be able to better manage demand and match it to supply and ensure that it's done at the right price, we will end up with incredible economic improvement and plugging those revenue leaks that exist across the portfolio for a traditional seller, right? So that's it for class 5. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm so sorry about the turned off my phone, didn't turn off my laptop, but I hope that I was able to get past those without skimping a beat. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit, I'm not sure, I think maybe some yield management for TV and video, or maybe talk about sort of portfolio optimization value for sellers and video holistically, maybe it's audience-based selling, sort of portfolio optimization. I'm not sure. I would love some more feedback. I've been thinking about this, but let me know. I typically start prepping on the weekend, so come back to me soon with some ideas. Thank you for your time and attention today. Light to all, love to all, peace to all. Thank you.